Okay, Alexander. The big news is, in my opinion, we're heading towards war, and we have the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife in Sarajevo. Right now, the situation is not good. Obviously, we've talked at great lengths in previous reports about the web of alliances that will now, in my opinion, be triggered. Absolutely will be triggered, as well as a lot of the tensions in the geopolitical landscape. We've talked about Germany, Austria, vis-a-vis Russia, France, Serbia as well, and the fact that this took place in Sarajevo. How do you read this, Alexander? I mean, I think it's the stage is set. The
I
stage is
think
set for those alliances to kick in
I think you're
and for war
absolutely right.
to break.
We are. I am extremely troubled and concerned to say this, but we are heading towards war. Now, can I just say that this is a remarkable situation that we are talking about, a war in Europe, because let's say it very straightforwardly. Franz Ferdinand. I mean, this assassination of him was a murder and an act of violent terrorism, an appalling act, but it is not an act which ought to precipitate a world war. After all, Franz Ferdinand was on very bad terms with the Austrian Emperor, Franz Joseph. The Habsburg court strongly disapproved of many of his proposed internal policies. And of course, he'd been barred from having his children succeed him to the imperial throne because, of course, he married his wife, who was, by the way, also assassinated in this awful act. His wife was somebody who had not been authorized to marry him by the court, and the marriage is not recognized by the court as a valid one. So the children would be, from their point of view, from the court's position, inappropriate children to succeed the emperor. So, given that this is so, given that he was on bad terms with the emperor Franz Joseph, given that he was on bad terms with many people in the Austrian government, given that, after all, however important he is only one person, and this is hardly an existential issue for the empire as a whole, and given that all the great powers of Europe, including Russia, have rushed to offer condolences and have made clear their deep horror and anger about this event, it's extraordinary that we are looking at a collapse in the international picture and the prospects of a war. And the reason this is the case is because of some extraordinary decisions, some truly bizarre decisions that are being taken in Austria, in Vienna, and especially in Berlin. And one can't help but avoid the impression that there are some people in Berlin and some people in Vienna who are trying to use this tragedy in order to start a war. Now, what is happening is that the Austrians are blaming the Serbs. They're saying that it's the Serbian government that was responsible for this assassination. Now, I should say straight away that we don't have, at this moment in time, definite and concrete evidence that that is the case, but I am fully prepared to accept that it is. It seems to me quite likely, in fact, even probable, that the assassin, a man called Gavrilo Princip, was in some way involved with the Serbian intelligence agencies. I'm sad to say the Serb government, or rather at least some elements that are connected with the Serb government, including some elements within the Serb intelligence community, have been prepared to take these sort of steps for some time. So it's not impossible that they were involved. But the Austrians seem to be intent on using this event and possibly Serbia's complicity in it, not just to get a proper investigation set up, not just to find out who was actually responsible, but in effect to destroy Serbia and humiliate Russia. And the authorities in Berlin seem to be backing them in doing this. So we're hearing talk now of an Austrian ultimatum being prepared, which is going to be couched apparently in terms which Serbia cannot possibly accept, because if Serbia were to accept this ultimatum, it would mean the end of Serbia as an independent country. And given that Russia is the ally of Serbia, and given that Serbia cannot accept this ultimatum, and given that we are talking about an ultimatum from Austria, that looks like Austria declaring war on Serbia, and of course Russia coming to Serbia's help. And that will set the whole chain of alliances that we've been talking about. Germany backing Austria, France and Britain backing Russia. That will set the whole train of alliances in motion. And personally, I think that in a month's time, at the latest, we will probably find ourselves in the run-up to a war.
Okay, before we get to the dynamics of a possible war and what that will look like, what do you know about this group, the Black Hand? What have you heard?
Well, it is a sort of mysterious underground terrorist nationalist right-wing Serbian group. It's known to be willing to carry out, as I said, assassinations. Gavrilo Princip was a member. It is clearly determined to see Bosnia, which many Serbs, with very good reason, by the way, see as an occupied part of Serb territory, occupied first by the Ottomans, then by the Austrians. And remember, we discussed the extraordinary way in which Austria essentially annexed Bosnia during the 1908-1909 crisis. We're going to have to come back to that shortly because, of course, this is a key event. So it's understandable that this group should feel incredibly aggrieved against Austria and should have carried out this assassination in order to demonstrate to the Austrians that they are not in full control of Bosnia and that Bosnia is not a place where Austrian rule is welcome. The extraordinary thing about this assassination, by the way, and something that's set many people thinking, is that, of course, this was well known in Austria. It was well known that people like Gavrilo Princip and the Black Hand were operating in Bosnia. And yet, Franz Ferdinand and his wife were sent there. They were driving through Sarajevo in an open car. The protection provided was, to put it mildly, fragile. I mean, there was hardly any kind of security guards. Apparently, attempts were made to throw bombs at the motorcade, which, missed and failed. And yet, instead of calling the whole thing off, they pressed on with it. And of course, one does wonder whether some people, maybe in Vienna, who, as I said, seem to be itching for a war, might have even staged the whole thing. Remember, as I said, Franz Ferdinand is not a very popular figure. It was not a very popular figure in Vienna in court circles. One is almost left to wonder whether some people didn't send him to his death in Sarajevo in order to get rid of a political figure they didn't like, and at the same time provide themselves with a pretext for a war. I want to stress I've got
two birds with one stone.
Absolutely. I want to stress I have no evidence to support this. I mean, it's always a good rule never to assume a conspiracy where incompetence might explain it. But the incompetence in this instance is so extreme that you could be excused for wondering what exactly was going on and why the heir to the throne was not and his wife were not better protected.
Yeah, I've heard reports that Princip was actually at a cafe and he just walked right up to the car and shot them. I mean, this wasn't a very sophisticated plot to assassinate the Archduke at all. I mean, this was a very, very Mickey Mouse protection in and around the Archduke and his wife. So the whole thing is just, I don't know, it's just completely bizarre. Going back to the diplomatic maneuvering that's now taking place, specifically between Austria and Serbia, Austria is preparing various ultimatums that Serbia is to agree with. And from what I understand, Serbia, I mean, both countries are mobilizing troops as we speak. That's a given, and they probably should be doing that in the case that something does happen. But from what I understand, Serbia is set to, depending on what's delivered to them. I mean, we have certain information what Austria is going to be asking, but Serbia seems like they're willing to compromise to a certain extent. I'm not so sure if Austria is willing to meet them halfway. I mean, it just seems like they're focused in on going to war. I mean, how are you seeing this play out?
I think this is all extremely grim and very dangerous. Now, Serbia is prepared to compromise. I mean, first of all, I should say that there are undoubtedly, I mean, I'm personally going to work with the view that there were people in Belgrade who had some involvement in this. I mean, I don't know how extensive that involvement was, but certainly this organization was getting help and support from within Serbia. But I think the Serbs do not want a war, obviously, with Austria, which is a much bigger and much more powerful country. And the Russians, who are Serbia's main backers, do not want a war. Now, a couple of months ago, we happened to know that the German ambassador in St. Petersburg reported back to Berlin. He provided a long, detailed report in which he said that the Russians, no one in St. Petersburg, wants war. Nobody in St. Petersburg is looking for war with Germany and Austria. I mean, this is not part of Russia's agenda at the present time. The Russians are in the throes of an industrialization program. They're in the throes of a major rearmament of their military, which is still very much is working its way through the system. We've discussed in our previous programs about how complex the political situation in Russia is, how the Tsar and his government, though they're in control of the country and in fairly solid control of the country, they have real opposition from the liberals in the Duma and the media in Russia, which is deeply hostile to the Tsar and wants to see him basically removed from power, or at least, if not removed, reduced to the role of a figurehead. And of course, we still have a very active and growing revolutionary socialist movement, increasingly now led by Lenin, which is also maneuvering towards revolution. And can I just say, we've also recently had in St. Petersburg a strike wave, which obviously it's only a strike wave. It's not created a political crisis. It's not comparable to the events of 1905, but it's obviously a sign that the situation in Russia, the internal situation, has its fragilities. But of course, though the Russians are not looking for war, at the same time, and again, the German ambassador reported this to Berlin, if the situation becomes really grave, if Serbia looks like it's going to be destroyed, Russia will act. It will defend Serbia. It can't do otherwise. Russia's entire diplomatic, political position depends on it. But Russian public opinion, which to be very clear, does exist, would not accept the destruction of Serbia and the obliteration, if you like, of Slav aspirations in the Balkans. So the German ambassador warned Berlin that the Germans need to play this game very carefully. The Russians are not looking for a war, but if a war comes, they will not avoid one either. Now, I don't know that this is either well understood in Berlin, and I question whether it is understood in Vienna. Now, I'm getting reports that the only person in the Habsburg government who is issuing warnings about this is Count Hoyos, who is the minister-president of Hungary, which is, of course, one of the major elements of the Habsburg government. He's apparently going around Vienna and he's asking people, what will Russia do if we present this ultimatum to Serbia? What will Russia do? Now, the Russians are advising Serbia, compromise as far as you can. We do not want war. Serbia is receptive to that advice. It doesn't want to be put into a position where it goes to war with Austria without the backing of Russia. But Russia will not allow Serbia to be destroyed, and the Austrian ultimatum, if all its terms are implemented, will in effect destroy Serbia. It will reduce Serbia to a Habsburg satellite. So it seems to me that the Austrians are pushing this in a reckless way. They are disregarding advice from people, the German ambassador in St. Petersburg. They're ignoring the advice that's coming from there, and they're ignoring the warnings of one of their own most important officials, Count Hoyos, who is apparently going around telling everybody, for heaven's sake, let's draw back. We're risking a European war. We're risking a war with Russia. Let's water down our ultimatum and let's ask the Serbs something which both Serbia and Russia can concede. But at the moment, I get no sense that anybody, either in Vienna or perhaps more disturbingly in Berlin, is listening. At the moment, they seem to be intent on basically smashing Serbia, even if that means risking a war with Russia.
All right. So I think it's worth noting that the foreign minister of Austria, they've done an investigation. They've prepared a dossier with regards to the assassination. They have not been able to prove Serbian government involvement. They haven't been able to prove that. And the dossier that was prepared, Alexander, the thing was just a mess. A lot of errors in this dossier.
Yes.
It wasn't well done at all. So this leads me to my question. They're still pressing on, though, with the ultimatums to Serbia, even though their own investigations, their own dossier was a complete mess and did not conclusively prove that the assassination was supported in any which way by the Serbian government. But they're pressing forward. Is this really just about absorbing Serbia, making Serbia a subservient satellite, or is this much bigger? You mentioned, as you were speaking in the previous segment, you did mention Vienna. You mentioned Hungary, but you were talking a lot about Berlin as well. Is there something bigger here? Because this push for war is obviously not about an assassination of an Archduke in Sarajevo. And the reason they keep on insisting on pushing forward with an ultimatum based on a very sketchy dossier, there's something bigger at play, isn't there? For some reason, the big powers or a big power wants war. And is it really just about absorbing Serbia or making Serbia a satellite state, or is this bigger? Is this a bigger vision?
No, of course it is. Let's just unpack what you've just said, because, of course, why is this dossier riddled with errors? Well, it couldn't be otherwise. How can you possibly do a proper investigation in just a few weeks and days and produce a proper dossier like this? The reason this dossier is a mess is because it's been put together in a hurry. And what is the hurry? What is the haste here? Why can't you take your time, investigate this thing properly, seek cooperation from Belgrade, seek cooperation from St. Petersburg, have this thing investigated properly? The Russians would be prepared to assist with that. Well, the reason you don't want to do all of those things, or so it seems to me, is because you want to use this assassination as a pretext for war, and you've concocted this dossier in order to lend weight to this ultimatum that you are preparing to serve. So all of this points to a situation which looks like a demand for war. And from what I understand, the person who's really pushing for all of this is Count Berchtold, who is the Austrian chief of staff. He's the head of the military in Austria, and he seems to be intent on war against Serbia. But obviously, Austria, though it's still just a great power, is not the major decision maker. The big decisions are being made in Berlin. Now, in our previous program, I discussed the fact that there is a sort of new tendency within German politics. Call it, if you like, a neocon tendency, a neoconservative tendency. People who position themselves or pretend to be on the right, though to what extent they can be called conservatives is debatable. Certainly, the old-style conservatives, people like Bismarck, would definitely not have recognized them as conservatives. And Bismarck, by the way, after his retirement, he saw some of the language and ideas that these people were coming up with, and he made it absolutely clear how bitterly he was opposed to these people. Anyway, these people have increasingly been talking about Germany as this exceptionalist country, this country that is destined to lead human civilization forward, that has to pursue some kind of Weltpolitik. There have been reports that the Kaiser has been listening to these people. There was a meeting apparently about a year ago in which a whole group of these people were called together, and they advised the Kaiser, to pursue this kind of policy which looks for massive expansion of Germany eastwards in order to give Germany the resources to achieve its position as the next global hegemon, the next global power, replacing Britain, and who speak about Germany having some kind of, destiny to achieve all of these things. And unfortunately, it seems that these people are very influential and are becoming dangerously influential in Berlin. And they've also successfully fed an atmosphere of paranoia about Russia in Germany. So even though the German ambassador is coming back and telling the Germans, reporting back from St. Petersburg, that Russia has no intention of ever starting a war against Germany, but it will fight a war if it is forced to. These people, these neocons, if you like, in Germany, they've been sort of building up this Russian bogey, this story of this great threat from the East. The Chancellor, the German Chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg, who is apparently open to the thinking of these people, has apparently already been saying that one day the Russians, if things, are allowed to take their course, they'll be seizing his estate, his own estate in East Prussia. I mean, bizarre, crazy stuff. But unfortunately, this has all been gaining traction. And apparently, these people in Berlin have been giving advice to the German government, and they've been prevailing in the advice they've been giving to the German government, which is to back Austria to the hilt, to support Austria, because they think that either the Russian warnings are a bluff, or if they're not a bluff, and if there is a war, well, Germany is so strong, the German military is so powerful, Austria will easily win its war against Serbia. Germany will easily win its war against Russia and against the Western powers. And then we will be in this great new world order in which Germany will be on top and will be able to decide the future of Europe and the future of the world. I mean, it's fantastic thinking, but unfortunately, it appears to be gaining increasing traction in Berlin.
Just to close out the video, Alexander, you mentioned Germany taking on the West as well. If this war is triggered, France and Britain get involved, correct?
Absolutely.
Or did they sit this one out?
Absolutely. I mean, this is the other thing that's changed. If you go back to the Bosnian crisis, which is, of course, the point where all this begins, because if you remember, if you go back to the Bosnian crisis of 1908, 1909, the Austrians and the Germans set out to humiliate Russia and basically to contain Serbia. And what happened was they antagonized Serbia, and we've had the Balkan Wars, which followed, which was basically Serbia's revenge and Russia's revenge, and which has now put Germany and Austria in a very precarious position in the Balkans. So this is partly what has led to this paranoia in Vienna, this belief that they must now settle with Serbia once and for all. And there's also a deeper paranoia in Germany, because the Germans have increasingly come round to feeling that though they are in some ways the most powerful country in Europe, they are also on the brink of decline. They fear that their moment is passing, that Russian power is growing, that in 10 years' time, Russia will have overtaken Germany as the most powerful country on the continent of Europe. And they're worried that both the economic and geopolitical situation in Europe is turning against them. So they want to stop this. They want to move fast. They believe that they have the advantage. They are completely convinced that Austria can defeat Serbia incredibly quickly. They don't take Serbia very seriously. They believe that the Austrians would defeat Serbia in no time at all. And they still believe, and there's an enormous amount of cultural bias here, they still believe that though the Russians would be a threat in 10 years' time, at the moment they're inefficient, disorganized, chaotic, their military is not up to the German level, and that it would take them a long time to get their army together in the east, and that in the meantime, despite the fact that starting a war will start with Russia will inevitably mean war with France, they feel confident that they can defeat first France and then turn around and defeat Russia too. I mean, to my mind, this is crazy thinking, but they really seem to think that. I think they're wrong on every count. I think they're wrong because I think Serbia's army, his military, is far better organized than they realize, and that the Serbs would be able to give a very good account of themselves against the Austrians if the Austrians attack them. And I think also they underestimate the extent of the improvement in the Russian military system that has already taken place. And I think they seriously underestimate the revival of Russian military power, which has happened over the last 7 years. So to give one example, I understand that Count Berchtold is concentrating the entire Austrian army against Serbia because he wants to defeat Serbia fast. And I think one of the results is that he's leaving Austria's eastern borders dangerously exposed at precisely the point when he is risking war with Russia, which, as I said, will concentrate forces against Austria along its eastern borders. And I think the Germans are making exactly the same mistake. They do think that they can finish off France in quick time, long before the Russian military has got itself in any kind of position to do anything on the Eastern Front. And I think they expect that they can have a quick victory over both France and Russia, before the year is out. And I think these are all dangerous fantasies. But they're dangerous fantasies which seem to have Berlin in their grip.
Right. And that would just leave the British then for Germany to take on. And any comments as far as where Italy stands? Because if
Well,
we're
indeed.
looking, I mean, are you worried that this can draw in the southern part of Europe as well?
Well, absolutely. And here we come back to where the miscalculations in Berlin are, I think, mounting, because, of course, the Italians are looking at this. They're supposed to be Germany's ally. They're not properly consulted about all the moves that Germany is making. They're becoming increasingly alarmed by the increasingly reckless policies that the Germans are taking. I mean, bear in mind, as I said, the Germans, one of the reasons for this megalomania is that there's also a sense of paranoia, the sense that, they're becoming encircled by the Western powers and by the Russians. And of course, paranoia often leads to megalomania. Anyway, the Italians are looking at all of this. They're saying to themselves, the Germans have taken leave of their senses. And I think the Germans expect Italy to go to war alongside them. And I think they're going to be completely disappointed. In fact, I think there's a better than even chance that if there is a world war, Italy will change sides. I'm not saying I know that for a fact, but I think that given that the only outcome of a war would be German domination of Europe, given the kind of leadership that Germany has, I think the Italians will say, well, we don't want that. We want to be allies with Germany, but a responsible, well-governed Germany that makes rational decisions. We don't want to be passengers on a runaway train where the driver is effectively going mad. And I think the Italians quite easily could jump the other way. And I think the same, by the way, applies to the Western powers. If you remember, back in 1908, 1909, at the time of the Bosnian crisis, the French and the British were very reluctant to go to war on Serbia's behalf or on Russia's behalf. And that was one of the reasons, alongside Stolypin's determination to keep Russia out of a war, why Serbia and Russia on that occasion backed down. But the way the Germans have been behaving, the increasing recklessness that the Germans are showing, means that French policy has now really hardened. And the French president, Francois Poincaré, who is known to be a hardliner where German issues are concerned, he's just been on a tour to Russia. He's been meeting Russian military there. And he's been going out of his way to make it clear to the Russians that if there is a war, France this time is with them. And so that alliance has solidified, partly because of French reactions and Russian reactions and Italian reactions, that anti-German grouping, to the way in which German policy seems to be out of control. And with Britain, it's the same. Now, the British, until a few years ago, tried to keep out of the quarrels in Europe. And of course, they've had a very, very difficult relationship with Russia historically, going all the way back to the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, most of the time, they've seen Russia as an enemy. But they also see this Germany in the grip of these neocon fantasies. And they're saying to themselves, well, is Germany a country we can work with anymore? Is it a country that is really interested in peace? It seems to be quite openly talking about establishing itself as the new global hegemon. And in light of that, we've no real option but to improve our relations with France and Russia. So what the Germans are doing is, it seems to me, that they're starting a war. They risk starting a war in Europe, which I think it's going to be very difficult now to stop, with Russia and France, with Britain almost certainly joining in on the French and Russian side, and with Germany gambling on a quick victory as a result of its underestimation of Russian and Serb military power. And I think those mistakes are going to lead both Germany and Europe to disaster.
All right, we will leave it there. And let's see where we end up. The Duran.locals.com, everybody. Take care.